And good afternoon, everybody. It is 1 minute afternoon, so I can say good afternoon. Welcome to Crossroads, where we have incredible conversations about where people's faith meets culture. When we bring together the stories of people's lives and how their background, their values, their faith informs their actions. We are so glad that you are here today, tuning in both on YouTube and on Facebook. And I think also we're going live on Instagram, at least for a portion of the time. I am so looking forward to today's program. It is going to be incredible. And we want you to go ahead and sign on in. I've got my comment section going here, and we're going to have an amazing time today talking with an incredible leader who's made such a difference in our world. As we get started, you can be a part of this conversation, helping out in comments. But most important, if you would right now, go ahead and share on Facebook and on YouTube and get the word out there. There we are. People are signing in. Help me out here. Are we on Facebook or YouTube here, Ben? Help me out. I'm going to give this back here. I think we're on there, and get me back to YouTube. That'd be great. I'm sorry, Facebook. Well, I want to begin. We're going to bring on our dear friend. This lady has made such a difference in this generation. Karen Wheaton's voice musically touched our hearts for decades as she sung on stages all around the world. I remember being with her as we would travel with Benny Hinn and other leaders all around the world, and the spirit of worship, the spirit of inspiration that she carries to point people toward the relationship with God that each and every one of us seek. And then several years ago, the Lord spoke to her about young people and making a difference in the lives of young people. And she returned to Alabama and launched what has become probably the largest youth ministry in America, certainly one of the largest, touching the lives of young people, giving them a sense of purpose, a sense of community, and a sense of excellence in all that they do. She is a modern day hero in our nation and in the church, and we're so happy to welcome her. Miss Karen, are you there from Alabama? Hello, how are you?
Oh, it is so good to be with you, my friend. We have been friends for a long time, haven't we,
We
Bishop?
we
And now
have,
to meet
absolutely.
your online friends and audience, this is going to be an incredible day. They are at the right place right now for the conversation we're about to have.
Well, and as we've prepared for this on social media, we started getting all these comments. Oh, I'm a front porch friend, and they were saying, take a minute and tell people about your front porch friends, because I think they need to know how they can meet up with you in that way.
Well, every Wednesday night at 9 o'clock Central Time, I'm just on my Facebook, and we just gather as women, mostly women, but some men join too. And it's people that are praying for and believing for situations in their life that are impossible. So I'm just there to encourage them because, Bishop, as you know, we've seen God do what only God can do. There's nothing
That's
too
right.
hard for him. So we are there to encourage their faith, to keep praying for their prodigals to come home, for their
Right.
families to be restored. So those are the things that we do on the front porch. So I'm loving it that there's front porch friends watching right now.
Well, and you are so kind to do this today because you literally returned just a few hours ago from your base in the UK. The
Yes.
Ramp has a wonderful base in Manchester, England. And I had the privilege, we brought your pastor from the UK, Joe Reeser, and also James Alarid on
Yes.
the last trip to Israel. Those were our first two pastors from the UK. So you've been over there in the UK with them, and you're joining us today jet lagged. But how was your time with them in the UK?
It was just absolutely incredible. Our base is in Manchester, England. And, Bishop, to see what God is doing right now, just globally, but especially his plan in Europe, and to see how he is moving to awaken people to the reality of who he is. We are
Yep.
living in incredible times to just get to be a part of that. So I loved it. England was incredible. And just, looking forward to all that God is going to continue to do.
Well, say we're living in incredible times, and I think of the verse in Isaiah that talks about times where great darkness will come on the earth, but in the midst of great darkness, great light will shine. And I think that really sets up our incredible guest today, Dr. Georgette Bennett. Um, she is an amazing individual. I could take 10 or 15 minutes and go through the accolades, but Dr. Bennett did her undergrad work at Vassar and has a PhD from NYU, New York University. And she's the president of the Tannenbaum Center, which she established with her late husband, Rabbi Tannenbaum. And she has had a career in media. She worked with Walter Cronkite on PBS with the television program that was called Why in the World, was an outlet that went out, a show that went out on PBS. Her books, she's written several books, and we're going to talk about her newest book today, but her books have been nominated for the Pulitzer Prize. She has been on the cutting edge of building bridges of hope, of compassion, of honoring the dignity of the image of God in each human being, no matter how different they are from us. She's an incredible human being. And I had the privilege of getting to know her through the late Harvey Kruger, who is a mutual friend of both of ours. But what we're going to talk about today is her new book, Thou Shalt Not Stand Idly By: How One Woman Confronted the Greatest Humanitarian Crisis of Our Time. And that, of course, we're talking about the crisis of the Syrian refugees, which is something that is underreported in the West, but we're going to be educated about it today. Would you all join Karen and I in giving a warm welcome to Dr. Georgette Bennett as she joins us?
Thank you so much, Robert. Now I just have to live up to that introduction. I am so honored to be with both of you. I'm in absolute awe of what you do and how you bring God to the world. And, in Judaism, the core value of Judaism is tikkun olam, the obligation to repair the world. And that really describes a reciprocal relationship between God and humanity, because we need to work with God in order to repair the world. There's a reason that the world was left imperfect, and that's so that there would be a role for humanity. And obviously, you are both filling that role admirably. So I thank you.
Well, it's such an honor to be with you, and really what we need more in our world that is increasingly filled with polarized toxicity, right? There's this effort right now to pull us apart, to focus on the differences rather than commonalities. We need more conversations like this, where we can learn from one another, grow together, and highlight amazing things that are happening. So, folks, you're going to have an incredible time learning about Dr. Bennett's story. But I would like to begin, if we can, before we get to the book, before we get to the story of Syria and what happened, your personal story, Georgette. You are the daughter of Holocaust survivors, and the story of your parents, and indeed the story of your birth, which you just touch on in the book. But honestly, folks, I'm telling you, it is a movie. I mean, it is a movie in and of itself. How your parents survived the Holocaust, the harrowing experiences they went through, and then the story of your birth, the fact that you were born and the fact that you survived the first few years of your life is just amazing. And it reads like a story out of Hollywood, or even more so out of the Bible. Can you touch a little bit on your origin story and let us know that background?
Sure, I'd be happy to. I was born in Budapest in 1946, which is the year after the end of the war. And I was born into a bombed out apartment building. But as you said, Robert, the fact that I was born at all is a miracle, because the chance of my parents having survived the war were very, very tiny. Hungary was the last country to be invaded by Hitler. And at that point, Hitler was already losing the war. And that meant that Hungarians were committed to making sure they could kill as many Jews as possible before the war was lost. So most of Hungary's Jews were wiped out very quickly. My father was Polish, and he had escaped from Poland. He had been through concentration camps. And my mother had a salon in Budapest, which she was operating illegally because Jews were not allowed to own businesses at that point. But she was passing. And every day she would go to a cafe across the street for a coffee break. And one day, this man walked in with a woman who it turned out was his sister. And he was talking about what had been going on in Poland. And the people in the cafe just said to him, "Oh, don't be such an alarmist. That's nonsense. That can't be." But my mother believed them. And my mother took them in and she hid them. Well, by that time, Budapest was being bombed very regularly, and people would go down to the basements of their apartment buildings in order to take shelter from the bombings. And one of my mother's neighbors spotted her with these two strangers and was very suspicious and immediately denounced my mother to the Gestapo for hiding Jews. Of course, she was a Jew herself. So my mother...
But she had been passing in society, kind of hidden, not knowing that she was Jewish, but she's reported as hiding Jews, these two who had come from Poland, warning
Yes.
her of this
Yes.
impending crisis.
Yes. Well, passing in the sense that she was operating a business, which as
Right.
a Jew she
Right.
could not do. So my mother was then sent first to a Hungarian prison and then to a concentration camp. My father was put on a forced labor train to Vienna. Again, he escaped.
Because one of these two that she was hiding ended up becoming your father. Is that correct?
Correct. That he became my father. Now, he had gone through, I think, the worst experience one can undergo during the selections in the Tarnów ghetto in Poland. His wife and his two daughters were shot in front of him. And that's how he lost his first family. So I was his second family. So he escaped again and went to rescue my mother. Now, my father spoke perfect German, and he was tall and blonde and looked like an Aryan poster boy. So he came across a German officer on his way back to Budapest, and he killed him. He stole his uniform, and he went to the commandant of the concentration camp that my mother was in. And he said, "You know, I have a girlfriend here, and she happens to be a very good seamstress. Why don't you have her work for your wife in your house?" And so the commandant thought that was a pretty good idea. So my mother every day would go to the commandant's house, and it was from there that my father engineered her escape. He had, in the meantime, found a hiding place in Budapest in a mansion. And he managed to get my mother there before her absence was noticed, and before they sent the dogs out to track her down. And it happened that this mansion where my father had found a hiding place was the place that the Soviets took over as their headquarters after when they liberated Budapest. and they found all these Jews hiding in the basement. And among them was my father, this Aryan poster boy who they thought was German, and Germans killed 22 million Soviets. So anytime they came across a German, that German's life was in danger. So was my father's. So he immediately dropped his pants and he said, "No, look, I'm a Jew." His life was saved by his circumcised penis.
Unbelievable. Unbelievable story.
Wow.
So just to finish the story, or at least this little bit of a story, the Iron Curtain then dropped, and my mother was again denounced by this same neighbor who had denounced her to the Gestapo, except this time she denounced her to the Soviet authorities, who put her in prison. For what reason, I never learned. But it became very clear to my parents that if they stayed in Hungary, they would just constantly be persecuted. Now, in the Soviet satellite countries, you could not travel outside of those countries. You could travel within them. And Czechoslovakia was one of the countries that was a Soviet satellite. So we packed up a suitcase and went to Czechoslovakia as if we were just going on a vacation, and from there managed to escape to France. And that's where we lived.
And how old were you at that time? You were an infant?
I was an infant. I was about 1.5.
But
And
part of the story, I just to say that if I have it correct, and I only raise it because you raise it in the book, your mother, your poor mother had suffered, I think, was it 7 miscarriages before you were born?
My mother suffered 7 miscarriages before I was born, and one of those was from lugging a sack of rotten potatoes home because there was nothing else to eat, because Budapest was under siege by starvation, just as Syria had been under siege by starvation. And that was how she lost one of her pregnancies. So the odds of my even being here to speak to you are very, very slim. But here I am.
Well, and not only
Here I am to tell the tale.
and what a tale. What a story. I have to agree with Bishop. This needs to be a movie because I want to hear every single detail of this story. Let me just ask you quickly, how long were you in France? That's the first country that you went to escape.
We were in France for 4 years before we got our papers to emigrate to the US. And we arrived here as stateless refugees. You know, I have the passenger manifest of the Ile-de-France, which is the ship that brought us over. And the passenger manifest lists the nationality of each of the passengers. But in the column that listed nationality next to our 3 names was the word stateless. And I've also kept the suitcase to this day that we brought with us because I never want to forget those roots. And in fact, I will show you something. I'm going to get up for a minute. This is something that I always keep where I can see it. This is the Jew star that Jews were required to wear because I never want to forget why it is that I do what I do.
What a priceless treasure you have there. And I find it interesting that you experienced, even as a child, the trauma of even being a refugee yourself somewhat, even when you came here. So knowing this story, this history, and how it's had to impact your life and your perspective, can you share with us just what was your reaction when you began to hear about the horror stories that began to emerge out of Syria? And did that have anything to do with the passion that you obviously feel for the Syrian refugees?
Well, it had everything to do with it. And the sad thing is that I wasn't hearing much about Syria
Right,
because
right.
the world was as silent in the face of the Syrian crisis as it was in the face of the Holocaust against the Jews. But my late husband, Rabbi Mark Tannenbaum, who was a pioneer in the field of interreligious relations and a well-known human rights activist, um, his institutional base was the American Jewish Committee. But of course, he was involved with a lot of other organizations as a volunteer. And among those was the International Rescue Committee. And of all those organizations, that's the one about which he was the most passionate because he had a particular commitment to refugees. And so when he died in 1992, I offered to take his seat on the board of the International Rescue Committee. So that's why in January 2013, I received a report that IRC had written on the Syrian crisis. And being a typical overextended New Yorker, and Karen, you're an overextended Alabamian. And Robert, you're an overextended, wherever it is you're hanging out these days.
Buffalonian, that's right. By the way, we had snow this morning in Buffalo, just so everybody knows. We did. We really did.
Well, come on a little bit further south. We've got a beautiful day in New York. Anyway, that report sat on my desk until May. But when I opened that report, I was absolutely stunned by the scale of the misery. And it so echoed the suffering that my own family had endured in the Holocaust.
Wow.
And so as a child of the Holocaust and as a refugee myself, I felt I had to do something. And one phrase that just kept, one sentence that kept reverberating in my brain was Leviticus 19:16. Thou shalt not stand idly by while the blood of your neighbor cries out from the earth.
Wow.
And while it may seem counterintuitive that a Jew felt she could not stand idly by in the face of the suffering of Syrians, I felt I had to do something. And we can get into what that something is whenever you're ready to do it.
We're going to
interlocutors.
Yes, we're gonna have that conversation. But folks, you've already been just mesmerized by this story. I mean, it is. I just will never cease to be amazed how God partners with everyday people who say yes to him. And to hear Dr. Bennett's story, to hear the trauma of her beginnings, and yet how she allowed her values, her beliefs to lead her and to guide her. And then we're going to get into a moment, the difference that she has made for literally millions of Syrian refugees. You're going to want to get a copy of this book, Thou Shalt Not Stand Idly By. This tells her personal story of the escape from Budapest, the escape from the survival, really, the survival of the Holocaust, not really an escape from, but a survival through. It will tell her personal story, and then it will bring you forward to what she's just beginning to tell there in 2013 when she received that first report, and how it found a place in her heart and in her mind, and she decided that she needed to ask. Dr. Bennett has generously made these books available to us, and we're offering them today for a donation of any amount to Eagles Wings, a generous donation. You go to eagleswings.org/crossroads, and they'll put that in there right now. The link is there in the comments, eagleswings.org/crossroads. And for your generous donation, and we're so blessed. Dr. Bennett has been a supporter of Eagles Wings work. That means the world to us. It really does, Dr. Bennett, that with all of the philanthropy that you engage in, that you find our work meaningful, has been such a blessing to us. And of course, Miss Karen, we've been able to take her pastors over to Israel. So you want to get a copy of this book. You want to share this with your children, your grandchildren, this incredible story that we're going to get into right now. And you can do that by going to that link. But just before we talk about the practice of this and how you moved into this, Georgette, I want to go back to, for a moment, the scope of this horror, because it's like something that does not reach the news cycle in the West, and it's unbelievable. But the numbers here are that there are over close to 600,000 people have been killed in this conflict in Syria. That's over 500,000 people killed just within the past, decade or so.
That's correct.
And over 7.5 million who have been displaced, who are either internal or external refugees. Their apartments have been destroyed, their homes have been destroyed, their lives have been destroyed.
It's worse than that. Actually, half of Syria's population has been displaced. Syria had a population of 23 million people. Of those, about 6.5 million are registered refugees, meaning they are displaced outside the country, and another 6.5 million are internally displaced. And yes, homes have been destroyed. The medical infrastructure is destroyed because attacks on medical workers and medical facilities have been used as a weapon of war. Schools have been destroyed. The war in Ukraine began in Syria because Russia is using exactly the same playbook in Ukraine as it used in Syria. And 80% of Syria is now in poverty. The life expectancy in Syria has dropped by more than 20 years. 80% of the refugees are women and children. It's unimaginable what has happened in Syria, and yet the world has been almost completely silent, except once in a while when a Syrian toddler washes up on shore, and then people care about Syria for a few days. But it's really one of the great neglected crises in the world.
Well, but it's not neglected by you, and we have to talk about that because your story is very counterintuitive. You're Jewish. The state of Israel and the Jewish people fight existentially for their survival all the time. You have Iran, you have the sworn enemies of Israel, you have anti-Semitism on the rise. You could have just devoted your resources, your time, simply to taking care of yourself. But the Syrians have made themselves the sworn enemies of the Jews. Not only did you counterintuitively really do what Jesus said, which is love your enemy. I mean, you've done the most Christian thing possible. You've loved your enemy.
I take exception to that. Jesus was a Jew. Let's not forget that.
That is right.
He got it from us.
I love it. Absolutely. Spot on. So not only have you done that, but you managed, and we're going to get into the story now, you managed to get the state of Israel and organizations and even government to cooperate with you. So take us through that journey. Tell us about that leap to you being the one to take this report. You get the report in 2013. You kind of understand this route, but now you as a Jew, you're going to move into this place and you're going to get the Jewish community and the state of Israel to cooperate. Tell us about that story.
Happily. And let me preface it with this. There are in the Torah, the the Hebrew scriptures, there are no fewer than 40 references to caring for the stranger. There's only one reference to loving thy neighbor, and that's because it's very easy to love somebody like ourselves. But there are no fewer than 40 references to caring for the stranger. So yes, what I did was counterintuitive, but it wasn't counter-Jewish.
Beautiful.
It's what Judaism demands of me. Now, when I read about the Syrian crisis in the IRC report, I saw an opportunity. I saw an opportunity not only to save lives, but to build bridges between sworn enemies. So my first impulse was to see whether I could catalyze a proactive response on the part of Israel, because after all, Syria and Israel are neighbors. They share a border.
Right.
Now, there was an untold story at that time. It came out later. Israel was already providing medical treatment to wounded Syrians or Syrians who were ill that needed medical care and were coming to the border. It was doing that very quietly. But that was reactive. It was wonderful that Israel was doing that, but that was reactive. I was hoping for a proactive response. So my first stop was to meet with the Israeli consul general in New York, and he was all in. He immediately saw that this would be a wonderful thing to do.
Who was consul general at the time? Do you remember?
That was Ido Aharoni.
Wonderful, wonderful friend of mine, and such a doer. I mean, he's a man of action.
Yes, he is. And he was all in. And my next stop was the International Rescue Committee, because IRC had a lot of boots on the ground in Jordan. And we were initially focusing on Syrian refugees in Jordan because that was putting such a pressure on Jordan. And if Jordan is destabilized, then the whole region blows up.
That's right.
So I met with George Rupp, who was then president of IRC, and arranged a meeting between him and Ido, and they arrived at something that they would do as a pilot program, because Israel has such expertise in trauma treatment. They thought that they would do that. 2 weeks later, I got a call from George saying that he had heard from his IRC people on the ground in Jordan. And they said, if we are in any way seen as partnering with Israel, our lives are in danger. Wow. And George said, sorry, Georgette, we can't do this. So there I was with egg all over my face. And I had to do a quick pivot. And I said to myself, okay, if this can't be an Israeli response, maybe it can be a Jewish communal response, because I wasn't seeing that at that time. So I happened to meet with Alan Gill, who at that time was president of the Joint Distribution Committee. We were both in Israel at the same time. And I said to Alan, I'm not seeing a Jewish response to this. He said, you're absolutely right. And we initiated the Jewish Coalition for Syrian Refugees. I had been working with the Jordanian ambassador to the UN at that time on this issue. And he said, why don't you scale this up to a multi-faith response under the auspices of the Tannenbaum Center, which you mentioned in the introduction, Robert. And we did that. And that became the Multi-Faith Alliance for Syrian Refugees, which eventually spun off from the Tannenbaum Center. And I'm very proud to say, before we get into the story of how we got there, that as of now, we have delivered about $245 million worth of aid, most of it directly into Syria, but some of it into Lebanon, some of it into Iraq. And that has helped more than 2.5 million Syrian war victims.
Wow.
And I'm very proud of that. I did not do it alone. I absolutely did not do it alone. And a lot of people deserve credit for doing this with me.
Can I ask you a question? Whenever you talk about this alliance, this multi-faith alliance, just for the sake of the perspective of even some of those that are watching right now that are listening to this from the Christian perspective, can you speak to the plight of the Syrian Christians that
Yes.
are in the middle of this chaos right now?
Yes. And by the way, the Multi-Faith Alliance is now made up of more than 100 partner organizations. We'd be delighted to have Eagle's Wings join us. We'd be delighted to have the Ramp join us.
Of course, that's wonderful.
We have a number of Christian organizations. So Christians make up about 10% of the population in Syria, Karen. And historically, they have aligned themselves with the Assad regime because they have felt protected by the regime. 80% of the population in Syria is Sunni Muslim, and Christians have some anxiety about Sunni Muslim rule. Now, that said, even though historically they have been aligned with the regime, a number of them have in fact been persecuted. There are a number of them who were tortured in Assad's prisons. A lower percentage of Christians have fled Syria than the percentage of Sunnis, but they are also suffering. And as we know, persecution of Christians is a terrible problem throughout the Middle East right now. The only country, ironically, in which the Christian population is actually increasing is Israel. So that, as you know, is a whole issue unto itself, the persecution of Christians in the Middle East. The Tannenbaum Center, at one of its board meetings early in the war in Syria, had a Christian bishop from Syria address us and give us a briefing on what was going on with Christians in Syria. And even though they are leaving the country at a lower rate than Sunni Muslims, they are internally displaced, many of them, in informal encampments that they've set up at the base of mountainous areas so that it would be harder to reach them and harder to hurt them. But at the same time, it also made it much harder for humanitarian aid to get to them. Mm-hmm. So that's the situation of Christians in Syria. Mm-hmm. Some countries, like Canada, have favored bringing in Syrian Christian refugees over Syrian Muslim refugees, and that's not government policy. Canada has a very successful private sponsorship program in which it allocates half of its annual refugee quotas to be handled by private sponsors. And most of those are churches. Mm-hmm. And that's the reason that the private sponsors favor bringing in Christians.
And I want to get to that in a moment because I want you to educate us on the three fears that people face in regards to that and some of these other issues. But let me just pause for a moment and say that we're so glad if you've just joined in. It's my honor to be co-hosting today with Karen Wheaton from the Ramp. We so appreciate her ministry and leadership. And we're having an absolutely incredible conversation with Dr. Georgette Bennett. One of the comments just said, it's like we're talking to a modern day Esther. And I really concur. I really concur. I mean, this is a remarkable
Whoever you
lady.
are, thank you for that.
If you're on Facebook, hit the share button right now. Let's continue to let people know about this incredible new book that I want you to get a hold of, Thou Shalt Not Stand Idly By. And this is from the book of Leviticus, how one woman confronted the greatest humanitarian crisis of our time. And as tragic and horrific and heart-wrenching as what we're seeing happening in the Ukraine right now is, and it's horrible, it has been happening for years on a multiplied exponential scale in Syria. And we understand that Putin destabilized Syria, and he's using that playbook now in the Ukraine. Georgette Bennett has made this book generously available to our Eagles Wings partners. And for your generous donation of any size today, go to eagleswings.org/crossroads. The link, they'll put the link in, please, into the comments. We want to rush you a copy of this book. It's going to inspire you. It's an amazing blend of personal drama with global change and how those two things intersect and work out together. And I want to just take a moment, and Georgette, you take the conversation wherever you want it to go. But when you and I chatted last week briefly in preparation for today, you talked about a strategy that I think was really a providential, inspired strategy. And I think you just did a TED Talk about this, by the way, of how does one individual bring change. And you got, by inspiration, I believe, a 3-step process. Could you, because we've got people here who say, I want to make a difference. You know, I want to make a change in my world, but where do I begin? You know, I'm a school teacher. I'm a retired grandma. I'm a plumber. I'm a this, I'm a that. How do I make a difference? You found a 3-step process for when you want to make a difference, what you can do. Could you walk us through that briefly?
I'm happy to do that. Before I get to the 3 steps, let me just give you a warning. The most important thing is to not look at the big picture, because if you look at the big picture, you will be paralyzed into inaction.
Wow.
So that's number one, because in these overwhelming crises, what you have to do is you have to find an entry point. And for me, that was mobilizing a Jewish response to the Syrian crisis. Then you have to identify a gap. And for me, that was Southwest Syria. Southwest Syria was entirely surrounded by regime forces. So it was very difficult to get humanitarian aid into that part of Syria. But it was very easy to access that part of Syria from the Israeli side of the Golan Heights. And after my 3 steps, I'll circle back to that in terms of how, after the disappointment with IRC, Israel was brought back into this. The third thing is to find something doable with which to fill that gap. And for us, that something doable was delivering humanitarian aid into Southwest Syria. Now, getting to that point took some doing. I had 2 partners. I had a Syrian refugee who today is the executive director of the Multi-Faith Alliance, Shadi Martini, and I would not have been able to get done what got done without him. Absolutely not. And the other was an Israeli aid worker. And we lobbied for a couple of years for Israel to be used as a staging area for the outbound delivery of international humanitarian aid into Syria. It made perfect sense because of that shared border.
Right.
But there were no takers because, as we know, politically, Israel is toxic, and people were not ready, governments were not ready to rise above politics in order to alleviate terrible suffering. So we lobbied the UK Parliament, the European Parliament, the Canadian Parliament. We banged on doors in Congress, and we met with every level of government in Israel and got nowhere. But then in September 2018, it happened. It happened. The Israeli government launched Operation Good Neighbor. And that meant it was now official government policy to open that border in order to facilitate the delivery of aid from other countries into Syria.
Now, I have to interrupt you, and I want to tell folks, this was 5 years. This was 5 years from when that report started in 2013 of holding on to the vision, holding on to the dream, not giving up, being tenacious, and following after that plan. And sometimes we get a vision, we get an impulse, we get a dream, and if it doesn't come to pass in 2 months, we throw up our hands and we give up. There is that need for, we do a Tuesday class. Georgette and Karen, many of our folks are with us today. It's called Torah Tuesdays. It's taught by the amazing Mark Gerson. And so many times Christians, we hear that thing of, well, the Israelites were stiff-necked. They were a stiff-necked people. But there's another way to understand and translate that verse, and that is stubbornness, in that you're going to have a tenacity. You're going to have a resilience to hold on to the vast calling that God's put inside of you. So I just want to highlight that this was a 5-year journey where I'm sure everything did not come together simply or easily, but finally you got the breakthrough.
We got the breakthrough. And that's when things really started to happen. And we were able to deliver $120 million in aid into Southwest Syria, support 3 medical facilities, a bakery that produced 15,000 pitas a day. Israel provided water, fuel, electricity. We shipped medical equipment, ambulances, clothes, food, medicine, sanitary kits, whatever else was needed, because our partners on the ground would tell us what was needed. We would source it. We would get it donated. We would ship it. But and there was an interesting consequence of all of this. Because of that, we were also able to help stabilize an entire region of Syria, because we were working through local councils. We were supporting a rudimentary economy. People were getting the services and the supplies that they needed. So the extremists couldn't take hold. Now, unfortunately, all of that came to an end. For 2 years, that was the only part of Syria that worked. And then in August 2018, because of a deconfliction agreement among Russia, Iran, Turkey, Israel, there was an incursion by the regime and its allies, Russia and Iran, and they ended up taking over all of Southwest Syria, which immediately deteriorated into chaos.
Wow.
Infighting, shortages of everything, assassinations. A lot of people fled north. But that did not stop us. We expanded our delivery areas to other hard-to-reach parts of Syria, northwest and northeast, and have found other ways to keep Israel engaged with Syrians, because those partnerships were so important in terms of planting the seeds for future stability in the region. So we're very committed to keeping that up. And we continue to lobby for reopening that border in order to help Syrians in the Southwest.
Well, I just want to say, I'm just so inspired by the impact that one woman has made working with so many other people. But to be able to see a need as you saw, and then take this to heart, and just your tenacity to hold on until you saw this through. It's so inspiring for so many of us that are watching right now. And I love your word concerning once you see the need, you find the entry point, you identify the gap, and then you fill it with something doable. So that just relates to all of us that are watching right now. But for those of us who are listening to this story, Georgette, what would you recommend to us that want to do something about this need, that in what you have shared is it moves our heart? Now, there's needs for us in all of our communities right outside of our windows. But when we are hearing this need, this something maybe we are hearing about for the first time, what can we do to be a part of something like what you are doing? What's the next step for us as listeners?
Sure. I'll skip the money part because all three of us are raising money for our organization. So I won't talk about that part. But look, there are 29,000 Syrians in the pipeline who have been fully vetted to enter the United States, 29,000 of them who've been waiting for years. And at some point, the infrastructure for processing refugees in this country will be put back together because it was decimated over the past few years. Once that happens, they will start coming into the US. And there are 5 pillars to successful integration for refugees. One of them is housing. Next is work, language, education, and trauma treatment. These are all things that we as individual citizens, caring people, believing people, are uniquely able to provide. So one thing that people can do is that there are 9 official resettlement agencies in the US. IRC is one of them. But 70% of refugees are resettled by faith-based organizations like World Vision and like the Lutheran Immigration Service. So volunteering with any of these agencies to help provide one or more of the 5 pillars of...
Would you repeat the 5 pillars for us, please?
Yes. Housing, work, language, education, and trauma treatment. Mm-hmm. Now, in addition to that, you mentioned before, Robert, the 3 great fears.
Right.
Unfortunately, for a long time, our policy has been driven by misinformation, disinformation, and fear. And in order to have rational and humane policies toward refugees, we have to address the 3 great fears that underlie that. And I'm talking mostly about refugees from the Middle East, Muslims. The first one is fear of negative economic impact. In fact, refugees are more entrepreneurial than native-born Americans. We fear that they're going to take our jobs away. They're not. They are job creators, not job takers. And within a few years, they pay more in taxes than the benefits that they have received upon arrival here. And even the countries that are the most burdened by refugees and can least afford them, like Jordan and like Lebanon, even those countries continue to experience growth in their GDP. And I can give you lots of other facts that debunk that fear of negative economic impact. The second great fear is terrorism. And I can give you lots of facts that debunk that as well. I mean, there has not been a single terrorist incident in the US that involves a Syrian. And there are 90,000 Syrians living in the US who came earlier, before this crisis. And I can tell you that the majority of them have high level, high skill jobs. There are thousands of Syrian doctors in the US who are very philanthropic. Their educational level tends to be higher than native born Americans. They are exactly the kind of people that we want to contribute to this country. And none of them have been terrorists. Not only that, but a Cato Institute study showed that the odds of being killed in a terrorist incident by someone carrying a refugee visa in any year in the US are absolutely minuscule, less than 0.01%. Your odds of being killed by your American-born next-door neighbor are about 286 times higher than being killed by somebody with a refugee visa. And then the third great fear is Islamophobia, the fear of being overrun by Muslims, by being subjected to Sharia law. And in fact, American Muslims tend to integrate very well. There's been a lot of research on this. They tend to be, they're very proud to be Americans. They are more concerned about terrorism than native-born Americans are. They tend
because terrorism kills more Muslims than any other people group on the earth. So
right.
Moderate modern Muslims have the exact same fears and concerns that we would have about radicalized Islam.
Exactly. And with all, as it is true with all groups that have arrived in the US, either as immigrants or as refugees, birth rates tend to decline over time. So it's a fear that is just not realistic. And Muslims in the US are integrated much better than in Europe, where unfortunately there's a very different experience.
Bishop, do you mind if I ask a quick closing question?
Go right ahead.
Can you tell me one more time about the title of your book, of which I'm so intrigued by, Thou Shalt Not Sit Idly By, and just how you came up with the title, and especially its significance as it relates to you and to us that are listening today?
Well, if it were Thou Shalt Not Sit Idly By, it would have been a very different book, but the title is Thou Shalt Not Stand Idly By.
Much better.
There was a lot of standing. And it comes from Leviticus 19:16. Thou shalt not stand idly by while the blood of thy neighbor cries out from the earth. And Christians share both, especially evangelical Christians, share both the Hebrew scriptures as well as the New Testament. And I think that's the way that it relates to all of us.
Definitely.
And by the way, I like to remind our folks that the Christian scriptures were also written by Jews, so it's all Hebrew scripture, something that we don't often think about. Folks, this has been just amazing. What an incredible time. And Georgette, thank you for who you are. We recognize that behind this kind of success, behind being able to send $245 million worth of aid, 5 years of not giving up, there were 100 or probably thousands of micro decisions that you had to make, micro decisions to keep going after the vision, to not choose your own comfort or an easy path, but to be tenacious and to keep going. And we are so incredibly, incredibly grateful to you. Thank you from the bottom of our heart for joining us today. And folks, it's not too late. Go to the website, eagleswings.org/crossroads. Get a hold of this book, hit the share button, and spread the word. And reminder, if you're in Buffalo, join me Friday at 7 at Elam, 70 Chalmers Street, for the elevation of our dear friend Bishop Matthew Brown. But Georgette, we want to just give you the final word today. Please just share a final thought with us. We're so grateful for your time. Karen, thank you for joining us as co-host today. But Georgette, a final word to those who've joined us.
The final word is this: don't be afraid to tackle the impossible. Just carve out a piece of it that is doable, and it will enrich your life immeasurably, as my life has been enriched by the people with whom I've worked, and how it has been enriched by the two of you today. And I thank you so much for your interest and for your heart.
Yes.
What a joy! What an honor! And we're gonna follow up, because there's 29,000 families in line, and you know what? We can't tackle 29,000 families, but we here in Buffalo, we can take on. We'll commit to one, and I want to find out what can we do to be involved. We can help with. We have people in our church who are employers who can help hire. We can help with language training. We can help with these practical things. So we want to find out how to follow your example. Thank you so much, both of you, Karen and Georgette, for this incredible conversation. Thank you, everybody who's joined. Have a blessed and fantastic day.